Who was Clement Clarke Moore? Did he really write "'Twas the Night Before Christmas"? And actually, what is the correct title of the poem whose first line is "'Twas the Night Before Christmas"? How did it create a new American tradition? How did Christmas replace Valentine's Day, Twelfth Night, and New Year's Day as major gift-giving holiday day? Who was Thomas Nast? Who invented Santa Claus? What was it that Virginia asked? Those are just some of the questions that we're going to work to answer here in a very special and very merry Jefferson Educational Society digital program. Hello and welcome, and happiest of holidays from us and ours to you and yours. I'm Ben Speggen. I'm the vice president at the Jefferson and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me is my colleague at the Jefferson Educational Society, Dr. Andrew Roth, a scholar in residence there. You might recognize him from his book notes series published by the JES, or maybe his American Tapestry project that's both a radio program featured locally in Erie on WQLN Public Media and nationally on the NPR One app, and a Jefferson Educational Society digital programming series. In that programming series, you might recall that when I've introduced him in the past, I've noted his accomplished career in academia, from lecturing to leading, as he's taught various courses before going on to serve in administrations in Erie and lead Notre Dame College in Cleveland as its president before retiring and being named president emeritus. Now, as I've said before in the past, he broke free from the tightening grip of retirement, and he heeded the call to serve as the interim president at St. Bonaventure University. And as I've mentioned in the past, seeing his vulnerability when it comes to maintaining a relationship with retirement, we at the Jefferson wrangled him in, where he's been serving as a scholar in residence ever since, offering numerous lectures, producing plenty of publications, and facilitating the Ramey Fellowship program. Here we're going to turn our attention to American holidays, and I'm proud to introduce a new series that we are looking forward to launching in the coming year. More on that to come in this episode. Here we're going to start with Christmas, a holiday and a topic Dr. Roth recently explored in his book notes series, which is available online at jeserie.org. Since this conversation is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. If you're listening to or watching a later broadcast of this event, still send us your questions, your comments, and we're going to get them to Dr. Roth. He and I want you to be part of this conversation, to keep it going, to keep the dialogue engaging. We're looking forward to this being a tremendous series for many episodes to come. And of course, for more information about both past and upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, do visit jeserie.org. And be sure to find us on your favorite social platform. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Dr. Andrew Roth, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Ben. And Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to you and to our listeners.
No, we're so excited to have you here, and I'm excited for this series. This came to be because one of my favorite lectures of yours, and I love all of them, but one that I've really come to appreciate is your approach to the history of Valentine's Day, and that got us started in conversation of how we might approach other holidays, and that led to the idea that we would create a series, and we can look at the history behind these holidays, how they came to be, how we celebrate them, what they mean to us. And so, Dr. Roth, I think a great place to start today would be set the agenda for us. What are we going to take a look at here with Christmas? And then what might we look forward to down the pike? And then let's dig into the history of Christmas.
Well, you mentioned earlier the program on WQLN, which airs on the second Sunday of every month, but I suspect most people listen to it on WQLN's website and on NPR's website and all the various and sundry podcast websites. But and we've done a whole series here. I think we've actually done it 2 or 3 times at the Jefferson, the American Tapestry Project. And in the American Tapestry Project, I'm trying to figure out how you tell the story of America in some kind of coherent fashion, because many historians of greater renown and greater ability than myself would argue that it's an almost impossible task. And when you look for the metaphor that holds it together, rather than just simply telling the same old stories in the same old way, one of the things that started to emerge to me that you see all of the themes, all of the threads of the American tapestry. And for our viewers and listeners, those who maybe didn't see any of those programs or hear any of them, and even for those who might have, a quick refresher, in the American tapestry, we say, there are two kinds of threads, without getting into the technicalities of weaving, the warp threads that you don't really see in a tapestry, but the foundational threads that hold it all together. And in the American story, that's, liberty, freedom, equality, and opportunity, the ongoing experiment in self-government, what might be called freedom's fault lines, all the times America didn't quite live up to its ideals, and the struggle by those who were excluded to be included by appealing to those ideals. And then, of course, the immigrant's tale, and the role of business and commerce in American history. And as I've been trying to think of what would be a theme, a way of weaving all, no pun intended, weaving all of those stories together, in a way that's a little different and a little fresher and that I haven't actually seen anyone else do. It hit me over the last couple of weeks or months that really the way Americans celebrate holidays reveal all of that. All of those themes, all of those threads are there. And so I thought one way of perhaps making the American tapestry stand out and be a little bit different than other versions would be to begin to look at that history once we've laid down that foundation that I just described, and we've done that in previous episodes, at how those themes emerge in the ways in which Americans celebrate in American holidays. And that's kind of led to this, and we're continually refining it and working on it. But one of the things we'll discover is that Americans, today we're going to look at American holidays, then we're going to look at the Christmas season, then we're going to get back to holidays in general, and then we're going to finish up with looking at the themes for that season and that series that we'll be going over in the next 2 years, 2021, and I suspect even into 2022. We're still sorting out how we're going to put it together. My God, you could have a holiday every day. There, as you will see, because the question arises, how many holidays do Americans observe? And this is not from any really sophisticated source. This is from Time and Date website. You want to know the time and date, you go to the website, and then you say, what holiday is today? They recognize 256. And I suspect that's not an exhaustive list. I've begun to do some more research. I think by the time you get into ethnic holidays and state observances, and then local and county observances, some municipalities have their own, you could end up with 2-3 holidays a day. And these holidays, these 256 holidays, they're everything from New Year's Day to New Year's Eve, from day 1 to day 365, it bookended. From Stephen Foster Day, which is January 13th, which is the first one that Time and Date list, to the Wright Brothers Day, December 17th, which of course is the day man first flew at Kitty Hawk. From Emancipation Days, of which there are a number of them, the most famous, of course, being Juneteenth, to Confederate holidays, which any number of states and communities still celebrate Confederate holidays. They have days on the calendar, and in some states, they're actually holidays. To Women's Equality Day, which I believe is August 26th, to Indigenous Peoples Day, which there are days, I should say, there are a number of them, but the new argument about what do you do with Columbus Day? Several states, I'm trying to think of looking at a note over to my side here. If I do seem to look aside at times, folks, it's because I'm checking some notes over here rather than misspeaking. But there's a new argument, and several states have actually replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. And so you actually see in that one sentence right there, everything we've been talking about in the American tapestry. You see liberty, freedom, equality, and opportunity, the struggle by those who were excluded to be included, the struggle by those who would continue to exclude them. It's all here. That's all in the holidays. There are 64 religious holidays or days of observance. And I doubt again very highly if that list is exhaustive. 7 sporting events. And I have an asterisk there because even a layman would recognize they've missed a lot. There's a number of them gone. Although one of those sporting events is rapidly emerging. We'll see later in the program on a list I have of the holidays in which the most money is spent, where the greatest consumer spending. There's one sporting day that has jumped into the top 10 and rapidly becoming one of America's major secular holidays. 13 paid federal holidays, 74 local holidays, from Robert E. Lee's birthday, January 18th, to Rosa Parks Day, December 1st. So there's a lot of holidays, and you can see through all of those holidays, you can see the thread of all, or the threads of the American tapestry. So that's what we're going to do in this new series over the next however many weeks and months, if not even a year or two. And as we get deeper into it and move forward with final, I hate Latinisms, with completing our programming, we'll have more dates and times for people to be very specific so they'll know when the series is going to run. As a kind of preview to how we'll approach these things, I thought we might take a look at, it's the holiday season, it is Christmas. We might take a look at how it turned out or how it came to be that Americans celebrate Christmas the way they do. And Ben, you made that comment, and you made the reference to the Valentine's Day program, which, since it exists, it would be simplicity itself to just simply reprise it in February. But I believe the first question to ask is, how did we get to now? How did you get to, chocolates and greeting cards and et cetera, et cetera? What is this holiday and where did it come from? Well, similarly, it's not so much, well, actually it is. How did we arrive at celebrating Christmas and New Year's the way we do? And it might surprise some folks to know that Christmas wasn't always celebrated in the Christian world. And in some areas, there is still some discussion of whether or not, in fact, it's an appropriate celebration. And that brings us to today. So we'll start talking about the holidays. And I made the observation, I think, in the book note, in last week's book notes on 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, that America's culture warriors can always find something to disagree about. And one of the things they disagree about is the current battle over Christmas. In fact, there's a book by a fellow by the name of Stephen Nussbaum, The Battle for Christmas, or The Battle Over Christmas, I think. And Nussbaum talks about it. And one of the things is, the current president of the United States made an observation that it wouldn't be Happy Holidays, it'd be Merry Christmas. And there was a controversy. Is it Merry Christmas or is it Happy Holidays? And it wasn't started by President Trump. He did not start that. This predates him. And this argument was, that somehow Christmas, the multicultural, diverse America, was somehow demeaning or diminishing the Christian celebration of Christmas. And I think it might come as a shock to both camps, the secularists, who thought they were being very modern with Happy Holidays, and perhaps to the rear guard argument that no, you got to make Christmas religious again. As I think you can see on Facebook my cursor being used as a pointer. That the spiritual one here with the outline of the nativity scene, as opposed to over here, Frosty the Snowman. But it might come as a surprise to both camps that this argument is an old argument, whether or not you should celebrate Christmas and how Christmas should be celebrated is not a 21st century argument. It's an old argument. In fact, it's such an old argument, you could say it goes back to the very beginning, actually almost to the very beginning. By the way, just so people know where I'm coming from, I would wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy Holidays. I think the whole thing is somewhat of a tempest in a teapot, and actually in many ways a contrived controversy, but it's out there. But it might, as I said, and at the risk of repeating myself for probably the third or fourth time here, it's not anything new. This is old. It goes back to the very beginning. It goes back to the very beginning of Christianity. And so the question arises, why is Christmas celebrated on December 25th? If you look in scripture, and there are people listening who know more about scripture than I do, but if you look in scripture, scripture never says when Jesus was born, does not give a birth date. To the extent that it says anything at all that could pin it down to a date, it would seem to suggest springtime, because shepherds would not be out in December. But no one knows the exact date. So how did we land on December 25th? Well, one of the things that happened is that the early Christian evangelist, and I use this word advisedly, the early Christian evangelist, you could even say starting with Paul, but this is a couple of hundred years after Paul. In fact, it's 300 years after Paul. the early church, as it attempted to spread and as it attempted to convert, they were very shrewd marketers. They understood the basic principle of marketing, that if you want someone to do something for you, try to figure out how to put it in terms they understand and that will serve their own self-interest. And so one of the key tactics was the Christian, and this is hardly controversial. If this sounds new to somebody listening and they think that I'm hardly claiming this as an original observation, this is an old observation. It was the Christianization of pagan rituals. And the most obvious and famous one would have been December 25th for Christmas. How was that arrived at? Well, Pope Julius I in 350 AD, more or less, decreed that December 25th was going to be the first day of Christmas, the feast day, the feast of the Nativity, and the birth date of Jesus. Now, why would he have landed on December 25th? And here we get into some confusion with calendars, but yesterday, Monday, December 21st, was the winter solstice. The winter solstice is the furthest point to the south that the sun is. If you're in the northern hemisphere, the winter solstice, the sun is the furthest. And I know for the astronomers in the room, the sun doesn't go anywhere; it's the Earth that tilts. But for the sake of a simple conversation, the sun is the furthest into the southern hemisphere. The winter solstice in all cultures, northern cultures, but all cultures actually, the winter solstice was for the ancient Romans and for the Nordics and Scandinavians, the major, I'm not quite sure what the right word is, the major religious or spiritual holiday. It was the day that was dedicated to the honor of Sol Invictus, the invincible sun, the sun god. It was named after the god Saturn, the god of agriculture. And the winter solstice was celebrated. It was the great holiday of the later Roman Empire. It was a week-long celebration of feasting and gift giving and singing and social inversion. And it was the major Roman holiday. And so Pope Julius had the clever idea that he thought, okay, if we identify the Saturnalia, as it was called, as the date of the birth of Christ, I can get more converts. People will come to me. And he kind of made, I almost was going to say a deal with the devil, but that's a connotation I don't want. He almost made an interesting bet that if I let the people celebrate the way they've always celebrated, they will convert. He won his bet, but it came at a cost. They converted to Christianity, but they continued then to celebrate Christmas the way they celebrated the Saturnalia, which was with feasting, gift giving, family events, public parties, some of which descended into or ascended, depending on your point of view, into orgies, but gift giving, feasting, drinking, and interestingly enough, you find the very earliest roots of Christmas caroling. And this was actually also adapted in northern cultures. The poor would gather together and they would go to the homes of the wealthy and sing. And the wealthy then would give them gifts of food and drink or whatever. And interestingly enough, because we associate this with Halloween, but it has earlier antecedents with the Saturnalia, if you didn't give them gifts, if you didn't give them food and drink, they would play tricks on you. So it's an early version of trick or treat. But Christmas caroling did not start out as quite the benign thing we think of it as. And so Pope Julius did that, and he actually won his bet. And so we see from the very earliest times that in the celebration of Christmas, and I think in Christmas it is more pronounced than any other Christian holiday, there are pagan influences in Easter, but Easter has, for the most part, maintained its spiritual purity, I would say. But there are certain things that happen at Easter that have very little to do with the resurrection and very little to do with the Christian sacrifice. Beginning with the word Easter, which does not appear in the Bible. It actually comes from, it's a Nordic word, Eostra, who was the Scandinavian goddess of the west wind, and the return of the west wind in the springtime was the return of warmth and the beginning of the growing season. And of course, chicks and rabbits, the fertility symbol there's obvious. You don't find them in the Bible either, but those were pagan symbols. But Easter has maintained down to today, to a great extent, Easter has maintained its integrity. Christmas, we've always gone back and forth between commercial excess, social excess, partying, and its religious roots in the West. So the next time, I think I said in book notes, the next time you're wandering through the mall and you're encountering all the sale signs and windows exhorting you to buy, and you are in your local grocery emporium with its 1,001 cookies and poinsettias and meat cases full of hams, or you happen to be watching television and you see a Mercedes-Benz ad, which has Santa in a red Mercedes being led by 9 silver Mercedes. I think in the full picture, actually, I think there's only 8 silver Mercedes. They have it right because Rudolph comes later. And you ask yourself, what does all of that have to do? All of that being this feasting and Mercedes, what does all of that have to do with the birth of the Prince of Peace in a manger? Well, that's a legitimate question. That's a very legitimate question. And there has been a struggle for most of Christian history between 2 sets of opinions. Those who would say it has nothing to do with the birth of the Prince of Peace in a manger, and therefore celebrating it in such a fashion is decadent and debauched, and others who say it's good. But on the camp of those who thought, this doesn't make any sense, this has nothing to do with how Christmas ought to be celebrated, would have been the Puritans. And in 1647, when Cromwell and the Puritans seized control of the English government, Britain didn't exist yet, of the English government, they promptly in 1647 banned Christmas as a decadent and debauched blasphemy that desecrated the true purpose of it. And in 1659, I think it was, Massachusetts Bay Colony outlawed the celebration of Christmas and made it a crime and punishable by a 5-shilling fine. Now, both of those things had a short life. By the late 17th, early 18th century, those bans had been revoked, although they had a lingering effect that lasted long in through the 18th, 19th, and actually into the 20th century. When I was doing the research on Robert Burns's Auld Lang Syne, I discovered that many of those strictures, because of course Scotland is a very Calvinistic country, and that would be not Puritans, but strict reformists. Many of those strictures or restrictions on celebrating Christmas were still in effect, and the Scots simply pivoted and then decided that New Year's Eve and New Year's Day would be their midwinter celebration. So, Christmas as a holiday, and if you're feeling guilt, if anyone is feeling a little bit guilty as they look around perhaps their own home or the community, and they're asking themselves, boy, is this the way? I would say, to relax, that this tension's ancient. This tension is literally ancient. It goes back almost 2,000 years to the very beginning, that how should we celebrate Christmas? There's been this tension because of the way in which December 25th was landed upon as a date. Well, after the Puritans banned it, we have Christmas then is really subdued, very rarely celebrated in any manner other than a very private, quiet, home observance. And the Puritans were good with it as far as that was concerned, as long as it was just simply a private thing. But things began to change. After the American Revolution, the early American holidays, if you can say this, Americans were quick to adjust. The earliest American holidays we'll discover, there weren't that many of them, for one thing, of course, New Year's. Thanksgiving was celebrated erratically. It wasn't until Lincoln in 1863 said it would be the 4th Thursday that there was any regularity to it. It was celebrated at different dates, and always in November, but at different dates around the country in different states, sometimes not celebrated. Obviously, Washington's birthday, that might surprise some folks, was one of the 2 major American holidays, Washington's birthday and the 4th of July, which John Adams in his diary and notes said should always be celebrated with fireworks and pyrotechnics, and it still is. And then, of course, we did mention Valentine's Day. And if we do reprise that, some of the folks will be perhaps surprised to discover that Valentine's Day was the major gift-giving day in the English-speaking world from probably the high Renaissance through the early middle 19th century, when it is supplanted by Christmas. And so the question becomes, how did that happen? How did Christmas supplant all of these other holidays to become the major holiday? Well, Christmas, as we celebrate it in the United States, and as it is celebrated to a certain extent in all cultures derived from the English, is essentially the creation of four people. I'm only going to focus really on America. And it might surprise some people that A, it's relatively recent. I mean, recent's a relative thing. Got two relatives in that sentence, but it's a relatively thing. It's relatively recent. It's less than 200 years that Americans have celebrated Christmas this way. Doesn't qualify as ancient, but isn't exactly brand new either, although we keep refining and adding things to it. But four men invented Christmas. Basically, the way in which we celebrate Christmas in America is the invention of four men, all of whom worked in the early and middle 19th century. Washington Irving, and actually, when you celebrate Christmas the way Washington Irving envisioned it. Charles Dickens, Clement Clarke Moore, and Thomas Nast. Dickens obviously is not an American, but in his A Christmas Carol, Dickens embodied the notion of Christmas as a private family observance in which the primary driving factor is family, the love of family, and the redemptive power of Christian love. The big fancy word in theology is agape, which is shown through the redemption of Scrooge. But for Dickens, it's a family event. And as it was for these other three, but it quickly moved beyond that. But less ethereal than Dickens, and I should have had that slide up there when I was talking about Dickens. I'm not going to repeat it, but the redemption of Scrooge is Dickens as Christmas as a domestic holiday. But less ethereal is Washington Irving invented the way we celebrate Christmas in two books. One, several sketches in his The Sketchbook, which is actually the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gentleman, in which it consists of about 30 to 35 really fun essays. The most famous of which, of course, are The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. And then, of course, Irving's Knickerbocker's History of New York. And Irving invented Christmas. I'm going to go back here. Irving invented Christmas in the sketchbook in 5 stories or sketches when he was visiting England. And they are Christmas, the Stagecoach, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and Christmas Dinner, in which Irving described an old-fashioned country Christmas of generosity to the poor, the singing of carols, feasting, dancing, and the hanging of the mistletoe. Irving's main character was a Mr. Bracebridge, who is determined to preserve or maintain the old ways of celebrating Christmas, and Irving determined to bring them to America. So when you gather around your Christmas table to celebrate Christmas this year, you're sitting around the Christmas tree, you are celebrating Christmas the way Washington Irving envisioned it in his sketchbook in the early 19th century. And if you kiss underneath the mistletoe, as they did at the Bracebridges in the sketchbook, you might ask yourself, why do we kiss under the mistletoe? Well, that's an ancient custom. Again, it's Druidic. The mistletoe was looked upon as a fertility symbol. Remember, midwinter, because it's a vine that grows in trees or on trees, and it stays green all year long. And so it's thought to bring good luck and to fend off evil spirits. And of course, one of its more common meanings, since it is a winter symbol, is a symbol of fertility and new life, which the worship of the sun, or the attempt to bring the sun back. All pagan midwinter festivals are about that. Irving's sketches, by the way, are now available in a standalone book called Old Christmas by Washington Irving, and those are the 5 sketches in which he invented Christmas in the way you do it. In his satirical study of the history of old New York, Irving told tales. His character Olaf, an old Dutch immigrant, told tales of St. Nicholas riding over the tops of trees in a wagon he used to bring presents to children on his feast day, which was December 6th, not Christmas, not December 25th. Smoking his pipe, Irving's Nicholas put gifts for children in stockings they hung by the chimney. These are not ancient customs. These are customs that were actually created by American writers. St. Nicholas, by the way, there's no historical evidence to indicate that he ever existed, but there is a lot of, no written document, I should say. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence. He was the Bishop of Myra in the 4th century. The bishop's robes are red, and we're going to fast forward that too. That's why Santa Claus's cloak is red. He's the Bishop of Myra in the 4th century. He was legendary for his generosity, for helping the poor, and for his kindness to children and orphans. December 6th is the feast day of St. Nicholas, and for a very long time in European history, and even to a certain extent in colonial American history, the gift day was December 6th, the feast of St. Nicholas. But St. Nicholas, by the time you get to the late 17th and 18th century, had begun to have a reduced presence in Western European culture, with one exception. In Holland, which to this day, they have these festivals and parades. This picture here is from a parade in Amsterdam in 2020. The Dutch continue to honor St. Nicholas, but in Dutch vernacular or dialect, it gets turned into Sinterklaas. St. Nicholas becomes Sinterklaas, which brings us back to Washington Irving and the early Dutch settlers of the Hudson River Valley, which is what Washington Irving was talking about, the Knickerbocker history, as Washington Irving brought Sinterklaas to the United States and to America. Now, the question arises, who powered Sinterklaas's wagon? And was it a wagon or a sleigh? Did he smoke a pipe? Was his costume red? Well, 2 years before Clement Clarke Moore published the poem whose first line is "'Twas the night before Christmas," there was an older poem, sometimes attributed to Moore, but it's not as sophisticated linguistically, and we don't need to get into all of that. No one quite knows. But in 1821, 2 years before Moore, in Albany, New York, a fellow by the name of William Gilley published Old Santa Claus as a gift for little children. And old Santa Claus, with much delight, his reindeer drives this frosty night. So now we know who pulls the wagon. It's reindeer, but he's not in a wagon, he's in a sleigh. Drives this frosty night o'er chimney tops and tracks of snow to bring his yearly gifts to you. Through many houses he has been, in various beds and stockings seen, and some white as snow, some neatly mended. So he gives children who are good gifts, but he also leaves long black birchen rods, such as dread the command of God, and directs a parent's hand to use when virtue's path his sons refuse. So the first descriptions of Santa Claus in a sleigh with reindeer, only one, wearing a red coat, is actually in an anonymous poem published in Albany, New York, the heart of Dutch New York, in 1821, not even 200 years ago. It'll be 200 years next Christmas. In fact, we'll look at it again a year from now. 2 years later, well, by the way, back to those birchen rods before I move on, the notion of Santa Claus as the gift giver is ancient in Europe. You also have in German culture the Christkind, which in German means child, Christ child, which sometimes had an L, Christkindl, which gives rise to Kris Kringle. You also have Kris Kringle. You also have Father Santa Claus, but Kris Kringle and Father Christmas had a sidekick called Krampus. For the children who were nice, they got a gift. For the children who were bad, Krampus came to make sure they were disciplined. Well, that brings us to the famous 20th century song, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, where he says he's making lists, checking it twice. He knows who's been naughty or nice. So be good for goodness sake, because remember, he has a sidekick, Krampus, who will remember if you've been bad. Clement Clarke Moore, this is Clement Clarke Moore, 2 years later, wrote, and the true title of the poem is A Visit from St. Nicholas. Clement Clarke Moore wrote his A Visit from St. Nicholas. Moore's Visit from St. Nicholas basically finished the invention of Christmas as we know it. Moore was a patrician New Yorker. He lived in Manhattan. Actually, he made a fortune. He resisted the expansion of Manhattan north of Houston Street when they outlined the grid of streets, because those of you who are familiar with Manhattan know that lower Manhattan, there's no such thing as a right angle or a street that goes straight. But north of Houston Street, you have the grid of the avenues and the streets, the crosstown streets and the up and down and the north-south avenues. Moore resisted that. He was a bit of a conservative, but when he saw he wasn't going to be able to hold the tide, he then made a fortune by building housing units on his family farm, and his family farm is the modern area or neighborhood of New York known as Chelsea. And that was Clement Clarke Moore. This gentleman over here, by the way, is Henry Livingston. Americans today will debate anything. And there is now an argument, did Henry Livingston and not Clement Clarke Moore write "'Twas the Night Before Christmas"? Who knows? Actually, Henry Livingston's family, Henry Livingston died in 1828. And so in fairness to the people who were challenging it, when Moore published A Visit from St. Nicholas in 1823 anonymously, he only acknowledged that he wrote it when he put together a collection of his, a complete collection of all his poems in 1844. And Livingston's family immediately challenged it, saying that Livingston had written it. Livingston died in 1828. Modern linguistic analysis seems to give some credibility to the Livingston claim, but who really knows? So even though, as a result, I'll give Clement Clarke Moore the credit, but with an asterisk. It was Moore who basically invented the modern version, not of Sinterklaas, but of Santa Claus, the Santa Claus that you know. He made him the joyful, plump, toy-bearing American Santa Claus of American tradition. It was Moore who had reindeer power the sleigh, not a wagon, and there were 8 of them, and it was Moore who gave them names. Dasher, Dancer, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donner, and Blitzen. As I said, Moore's wealth came from the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan. This is the General Theological Seminary where Moore taught for many years in Manhattan. It was Moore in A Visit from St. Nicholas who created the modern notion of Santa Claus as we understand it. The jolly, plump fellow with the long stem pipe, the red cloak, the sack full of toys, who comes down the chimney. "'Twas the night before Christmas when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. All the stockings were hung by the chimney with care in the hopes that St. Nicholas," notice St. Nicholas, not Santa Claus, "that St. Nicholas would soon be there. And he whistled and shouted and called them by name, now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donner and Blitzen. And his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot, a bundle of toys he had flung on his back. His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry, and the beard on his chin was as white as snow. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team, gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim ere he drove out of sight, 'Happy Christmas to all, and to all good night.'" When you celebrate Christmas this week, and go to the church of your choice, but when you come home after you've left church, and you come home and you're with your family or friends, everything you're doing is essentially from then on is really in many ways the creation of Washington Irving, Clement Clarke Moore, and Charles Dickens. And when you envision Santa Claus, if I asked you right now to close your eyes and envision Santa Claus, the image you have of Santa Claus is probably going to look very much like this. The roly rose-colored cheeks. And this was created by Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast was a German immigrant in the middle of the 19th century. He is generally considered to be the greatest American political cartoonist, but perhaps people who like Oliphant and some others will argue that, and I think those are legitimate arguments. But he was certainly the father or the creator of the American political cartoon, legendary for his attacks on Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall. He also created the elephant as the symbol of the Republican Party and the donkey as the symbol of the Democratic Party. But he's most famous for he and his depiction of Santa Claus is the Santa Claus that all of us know and are familiar with. Now, where did Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer come from? Real quickly, for over 100 years, Santa did okay with only 8 reindeer. But in the late 1930s, Montgomery Ward, which most people today, I need a footnote to explain what Montgomery Ward was, but some folks in the audience will remember that once upon a time, Montgomery Ward and Sears and Roebuck were the great retail behemoths of American commerce. They had in-place stores, but they also had catalogs and enormous mail order projects. Anyways, sometime in the 1930s, Montgomery Ward decided rather than pay outside publishers to produce the coloring book they gave children every year, that their in-store Santas gave children every year, they decided to produce it themselves. And they asked this gentleman over here, this is Robert May, they tasked him, they didn't ask him, they told him, he worked in their advertising department as a copywriter. They tasked him with writing a story to go with the coloring book they wanted to hand out at Christmas. May thought about it for a while. His daughter, that's his daughter Barbara there, loved the deer in the Lincoln Park Zoo. So May decided, okay, Santa's going to have a deer. May himself was, although he's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Dartmouth, told about his childhood that he was small and shy and teased by the other students. And so he tended to think of his deer as teased. And one day he had the inspiration, looking out across Lake Michigan into a fog, that if the lead deer had a light on his nose, he could lead him through the gloom. And hence was born Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, which becomes a part of American folklore. And that was 1939, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And actually, it didn't get passed beyond Montgomery Ward until 1949, when Gene Autry recorded the most famous version of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and it became the #1 Billboard hit of 1949. And it's actually one of the biggest selling single records of all time. It sold 2 million copies of one in 1949 alone. And then, of course, Rudolph's had television programs, video games, movies, and has become part of American folklore. The other thing we'll celebrate this season would be is Auld Lang Syne. I have a suspicion that any number of you have any number of times at a New Year's Eve party with your favorite libation in one hand and your arm around your spouse or significant squeeze or whomever happens to be at hand, have sung or at least hummed, "Should old acquaintance be forgotten, never brought to mind," and had no idea what you were saying. Or maybe some idea, because old sounds like old, and you get what an acquaintance is as a friend, and you kind of intuit that it means old friend. It's a rhetorical question, by the way, Burns is asking. He's saying, no, you don't want to forget old friends and the good times of the past. So that's a real nutshell, real quick. A year from now, we'll go into a much deeper dive into the history of Christmas. But that's a real quick survey in terms of Christmas and New Year's of how we got to now and how it is we celebrate them the way we do. But let's bring back Ben into the conversation and talk about the series. How many holidays do Americans observe? And just simply repeating that, they observe 256, which is amazing if you think about it.
That really is, Dr. Roth, and I'm happy to announce that the Jefferson now has 256 programs coming up throughout the year 2021. No, I'm just kidding. But thank you for that wonderful overview of from then to now of Christmas, leading into New Year's, and taking a look at how we're going to break apart a look at the American holidays. And I know you have this on a final slide because I got a chance to take a look at the presentation in advance, but our email addresses are going to be up there. They're simply our last names, which are also on the screen, right in our image windows here. You can write to Dr. Roth and to me and tell us what you think about American holidays, what you'd like to learn as we work to unpack these and make sense of that. Because hyperbole aside, we're not going to squeeze in 256 programs on American holidays alone. So we're going to have to leave some out. We're going to have to make sure we include some. So not everything's going to be discussed, but we're going to unpack this throughout the course of the next year. And we'd love to hear from you, our viewers, our audience, our listeners, what you're interested in and how we can help you learn more about the history behind your holidays. Dr. Roth, one of the things that I really appreciated was the ability to go back and learn that an issue that we may think is contemporary actually has a bit of history behind it, which is how Christmas came to be as it is, and the debate between celebrating it as a religious holiday or a more secular holiday, and we see the commercialization of that. So I've got to ask you, what surprised you in doing this research as you started unpacking it? Was there something that you hadn't known before that you came across that you thought, my
Well,
gosh,
what
that surprised me?
I'm not sure surprised, but to pick up on what you just said about the religious versus the secular, um, I have to say from time to time I've felt a little like, what are we doing? And I suspect everybody listening to this, you have a family gathering, and particularly, God love them, with little kids, everybody opens up packages and after a while you lose track of what is happening or what came from where or who did what. And sometimes you think, oh my, but what are we doing? But actually, in this research, it's made me more comfortable with that, if I can say that, because it's ancient. Actually, Christmas is really the conflation, if you will. That's a big fancy word. The combination of two different things, and maybe they've had historically some uneasiness in them. But you have a Christian religious feast, even if it may turn out to be historically inaccurate, that Julius just arbitrarily picked December 25th, but celebrating the birth of the Christ. And you also have the continuation of an ancient midwinter celebration of life that, at least in northern climes, at the darkest, least fruitful time of the year, you have this great expression of life, this great, reaching out of life and joy. And those two things, I do think come together, perhaps maybe not perfectly. And the tension you hear between Happy Holidays and Merry Christmas, and we talked about the Puritans banning the secular celebration. That tension's there, but it's really, in both instances, extremely life affirming. I think that's the phrase I was looking for. In both instances, they're great expressions of life, of the affirmation of life, of generosity, of caring for others, and that we're all in this together. Conscious of the time a little bit, looking at some of the things to show the folks what we're going to be looking at as we work on American holidays and try to weave them into the themes and threads of the American tapestry. American holidays, besides having 256, the big ones will come as no surprise. I just arbitrarily did this American holidays by consumer spending. I'm not sure back to college and back to school qualify as holidays, and I was going to drop them, but that's the way the Retail Federation of America lists this. This is their data. But Christmas and Thanksgiving, the per capita spending dwarfs everything else except back to college and back to school. But you have Mother's Day, and we're going to discover that Mother's Day and Father's Day were actually commercial contrivances in a commercial land. Mother's Day is a little more complicated because of Anna Jarvis. Valentine's Day, which was once number one, the holiday, that might sound strange to some people who always think of it as chocolate, maybe a night out to dinner, but that was once the great, or little kids, children, In fact, you'll notice on Valentine's Day, the saint is gone. It was once Saint Valentine's Day, and the saint's gone. Easter's there, Halloween, obviously July 4th, St. Patrick's Day, and the Super Bowl. That's the one I was mentioning earlier. The sporting event has now climbed into the top 10 holidays in terms of consumer spending. And I don't know what they're spending on, but I'm assuming that's mostly food and drink. People haven't yet gotten to giving gifts on Super Bowl days. Yeah. Somebody will figure that out.
I was going to say, I think that's the key word, yet. And, what's so interesting about that, Dr. Roth, is we were talking about, that also leads us to then question America's pastime. And that reminds me of a program that we had at the JES, I want to say at least 2 years ago now, where we brought in sports biographer, Mr. Frank Garland, who has written biographies of several baseball players. We talked about the idea of transitioning of, is baseball still America's pastime, and that perhaps football has replaced that. And we've talked about this offline, and I think it's worth mentioning to see that that's the one sports holiday on here, is that it's the culmination of the entire season hinges on just 3 hours, not a game 7, a potential game 7, because we don't always get to a game 7 in the World Series or the Stanley Cup playoffs, but rather here we have one game pitting the two best teams in a runoff playoff system against each other just one time for about 3 hours. And that's a lot of airtime to put on a lot of commercials.
Yeah. And actually, you're absolutely right. And this is probably the Super Bowl makes it in here. This is, we're kind of in Marshall McLuhan's world. The medium is the message. In the world of television, where you're going to have an event that everybody can see, there are only 3 sporting events, I think, that consistently show up amongst top-rated programs. And those 3 sporting events all have one thing in common. They are one-off championships. The Super Bowl is on a date, I don't know what it is this year, but we could look it up. It's February 2nd is a Tuesday, which means February 1st is a Sunday, which means it's probably February 8th is this year's Super Bowl. The Monday of the Final Four, there will always be a national championship game and the Kentucky Derby. Every other sporting event have multi-game tournaments in which there's no ability to predict with absolute certainty that the championship game will take place at this date at this time. And so forgetting the sports for a moment and just talking like a marketer, and I was involved in marketing in another life, that gives those 3 events a powerful promotional advantage that the other sports don't. But that'd be another thing. So anyways, this is the American holidays by consumer spending, which is, if there's anything secular, that would be it. That's a secular way of looking at it. But you also have patriotic holidays. I'm right, sorry, Ben?
There are other ways to look at it, and that's what I was going to say. The patriotic holiday is what our country looks at in terms of our history and acknowledging, and just with a quick Google search on the side here on my screen, it is the Super Bowl is scheduled to happen on Sunday, February 7th. So we're right on with that. That's the marketing opportunity for folks looking to have a lot of eyeballs on televisions at one time for a very popular American holiday now. But the patriotic holidays.
And you see the patriotic holidays. The 4th of July, of course, was first. I could have added Juneteenth and some others, and I will on another slide show some folks on other things here. But these, of course, are celebrating the great American ideals of freedom, liberty, equality, and opportunity, and those who struggled for them. And these holidays aren't fixed in time. As I said a while earlier on, maybe at the front end of the program, Washington's birthday was one of the major American holidays in the late 18th and early 19th century. Nowadays, it's not even really celebrated, although I think legally in the federal law that created the federal holidays, we'll see in a moment, it's called what, but it's become President's Day. It gets combined with Lincoln's birthday, which also happened coincidentally to be in February. But it's also now turned into a day to honor all presidents, and in such doesn't honor any of them really in any meaningful way. We'll come back to that. And of course, Memorial Day, which we think of as Memorial Day, was actually originally Decoration Day, and it was a day to celebrate the Civil War dead in the North. And then Veterans Day was originally Armistice Day. So None of these are actually fixed in time, and there's some other minor ones people may not know. Well, minor only in the sense they're not as observed as widely as perhaps they should. The things they honor aren't minor: the flag, the Constitution, the Election Day, Bill of Rights Day.
Well,
We mentioned, no, I'm sorry, Ben.
and I was going to say, I think that's one of the things that goes back to what you've been covering in the American Tapestry Project is how our story evolves and how we're changing. And I think that that's part of now a more concerted effort and concentration on acknowledging Juneteenth, June 19th, because not all people were independent on Independence Day. Not all Americans were independent on that day. And that's something that we've been grappling with. And looking at that in context of how these holidays have been movable and how they've evolved over time reminds us these aren't etched in some stone calendar somewhere, that we have to observe them always the way that they were initially begun. And I think that's a fascinating part of our history to be reminded of throughout this process.
Well, and you touched on an important theme. I mean, the American story, there are some people who would like to freeze frame it, say it's done, that's it. There's nothing going to change. We're just going to, kind of like in a Groundhog Day, do the same thing over and over and over and over. But actually, the American story is an ongoing, developing story. And it's a story that is coherent because it has themes and threads that are through all of the versions, but it keeps refining and telling the story in different ways. Federal holidays. They keep getting added. In fact, the president by executive order made December 24th a federal holiday this year, and I assume it will remain such into the future. Columbus Day is an interesting one. Columbus Day is a federal holiday, but as I said earlier, in terms of the change, several states have replaced it with Indigenous Peoples Day. And there are some people who attack Columbus Day as, the exploitation, and I'm not going to get into all of that right now. We'll look at that when we look at these dates, at these holidays later. But actually, Columbus Day was created in the early 20th century by Italian immigrants who were being brutally discriminated against, who wanted to celebrate what, 100 years ago, they thought was a pretty non-controversial figure who happened to be of Italian ancestry, Cristoforo Colombo. And that's where Columbus Day actually comes from. It wasn't really celebrating conquest, it was celebrating Italian ethnicity. We'll come back to that. Now, state holidays and curiosities. I mean, Groundhog Day in Pennsylvania is not actually a holiday. That's why I call that a curiosity, but it could be a holiday. Maybe it should be a holiday. Maybe we could get some local representatives to pay attention to something that might actually have some consequences. Make Groundhog Day a holiday.
And there are other states that have other groundhogs who also celebrate. There are other towns that have this. Pennsylvania and of course Punxsutawney Phil happens to be at the top of the list of the most notorious.
Punxsutawney Phil's a big one, but there is such a character as Buckeye Chuck.
Right, and so each states have these. So it's fascinating to see how one rises to the top, the Keystone State, our own Punxsutawney Phil, but there are plenty of other groundhogs who are apparently meteorologists out there and weather prognosticators. So it's interesting to see how locally places embrace holidays and traditions and build some sort of mythos around that.
And I just want to go over some of these quickly. You see actually some of the themes that we talked about, freedom and equality and those who would deny it. Patriots Day is a state holiday in Massachusetts, and that's the day of the Battle of Lexington and Concord and the start of the American Revolution. And it is a state holiday, and everything in Massachusetts shuts down. They run the Boston Marathon. The Boston Red Sox play a home game, and the rest of the time people party. You have Evacuation Day as a holiday in Boston. That's the day the British left Boston during the siege of Boston during the American Revolution. But you also have Confederate Heroes Days. It's an official holiday in Texas, but I could have listed about 4 or 5 other states that on different days of the year, for some reason, have a Confederate Heroes Day. We don't need to get into that. Juneteenth is Emancipation Day. I thought I had Emancipation Day. Juneteenth and some Emancipation Days are also holidays, and there is some talk now of Juneteenth becoming a major holiday because June 19th was the day in I'm drawing a blank on the date. It was the last state to declare. Texas emancipated the slaves and acknowledged the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. Pioneer Day is a major holiday in Utah. The Mormon trek to Utah, and this is, if you've ever been to Utah or Temple Square in Salt Lake City, of the Mormon pilgrims crossing the Great Desert, the Great Basin, pulling their belongings behind. They didn't even have horses. They pulled them themselves. Of course, that's a Minuteman and Juneteenth. There are numerous cultural and religious holidays. 26 Christian holidays, 24 Jewish holidays, 7 Muslim holidays, only 1 Hindu holiday, and there are numerous other denominational holidays, and there are 30, you can count them, cultural observances of ethnicity, from St. David's Day, which is Welsh, to National Tartan Day, which is Scottish, to St. Patrick's Day, I don't need to explain that one, to Bastille Day, to Leif Erikson Day, to Native American Indigenous Peoples Day, replacing Columbus Day, and to Kwanzaa. And so that's going to be a program unto itself, which I say it's, in fact, on the program list, I call it A Nation of Immigrants Celebrating Their Origins. And that's going to be a program. So the American Holidays, the series, what we're looking forward to doing is, as it stands now, and I will get to a last slide, Ben mentioned it earlier, where we're interested in suggestions and comments. On February 2nd, we will do Candlemas, Groundhogs, Chocolate, and President's Day, which all of those things happen in February. But we'll also be looking at Celebrating Freedom Part 1 and Celebrating Freedom Part 2, the Patriotic Holidays, commercial holidays, Mother's Day, Secretary's Day, Grandparents' Day, and I should have probably put many, many, many more. Anything you could sell flowers for, there's a holiday. Ethnic holidays, A Nation of Immigrants Celebrates Origins. Sporting days, we'll look at state holidays and other curiosities. And then next November and December, we'll take a more thorough look at Thanksgiving, which is obviously more than turkey and football, and a deeper, more comprehensive look at the history of how Christmas has been celebrated. So that's the new series that we're putting together. And I don't really, in some ways, want to call it a new series. It's a continuation of the American tapestry as we look at American holidays as a way of weaving together and telling the American story.
And that's, I think it's such a fascinating way to look at, how we tell ourselves the story and how we celebrate moments around that, and how those do change over time, and how those become not perhaps what they were originally intended to be. I think of, the various times where there's an incentive to buy a car or to buy a mattress or to buy a TV on Memorial Day, Labor Day, Columbus Day, so on and so forth. And so it's going to be so interesting to unpack that. And folks, we want you there with us right alongside for the journey as we learn the history behind these holidays and how they help us better understand the American narrative, the American story. So right there on the screen, our 2 email addresses. Dr. Roth is at Roth, ROTH at jeserie.org. And I'm at Speggen, Speggen at jeserie.org. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. Tell us some of your favorite memories. Tell us the way that you've celebrated. Tell us the history of your own holidays, what you're interested in learning from us. We'll be back. We promise not with 256 programs, not to overwhelm or inundate you, but plenty of learning opportunities. And of course, these are some of the topics that Dr. Roth is covering in his writings for the JES. You can head over to the website there, jeserie.org, to find his book notes series. So far, the one on Twas the Night Before Christmas is out. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer will make an appearance this week, we promise. Christmas Eve, look in your inbox, not down the chimney. You'll get an email from us. And we'll be on the website as well. You can check that out there. And for New Year's, we'll take a look at Auld Lang Syne, the Robert Burns poem, and the history behind that. You can also catch that in your inbox if you sign up for those emails, but also on the website at jeserie.org. Dr. Roth, Scholar in Residence, I got to find out what day, what holiday we celebrate Scholars in Residence, because if there's not one yet, I'm going to pitch it to Hallmark and we'll buy you a card, I promise. But Dr. Andrew Roth,
okay.
A big thanks to you, Scholar in Residence, host of the American Tapestry Project on WQLN Public Media, with episodes available online, WQLN.org, and on the NPR One app. A man of many, many talents and many great holiday backgrounds. I think of the JES team, you've won for the best backgrounds this holiday season. There you've got a
Oh,
great.
by the way, for our audience behind me, if I can get out of the way here somehow.
You've got Perry Square there. It's beautiful.
That's Perry Square.
Beautifully lit, amazing trees. But Dr. Roth, a man of many, 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 many talents. Thank you for your time, energy, and efforts in all of this project, and all the rest that you do. And for joining us here for this conversation to be able to explore American holidays, taking a look at Christmas and what's to come. Plenty to chew on here for these questions. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And of course, to all of you watching along at home, a big thanks to you for tuning in. We appreciate you. We're looking forward to our new JES digital programming series, American Holidays. We hope you will tune in, write to us. We're excited to hear from you. And of course, more information about this series. We do have the first one coming up February 2nd. We're going to take a look at those holidays then. But we'll have more information available at jeserie.org and across our social platforms. You can head there to also catch discussions featuring Dr. Andrew Roth, including 2 looks at 1968 and his American Tapestry series. And you can read his book notes. I've already mentioned those, jeserie.org, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. You're also going to find other videos of other past presentations, all archived, all available for free to stream on demand at your leisure, and a list of all the publications we've put out throughout the course of the year 2020, more than 100 publications, all available to download for free on our website, jeserie.org, and links to those on our social platforms. So be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Speggen. May your holidays be as merry and bright as they can be. Thank you for listening and learning with us. We'll see you in 2021.